when we look forward, meaning, let me identify here two elements that I consider to be today still lacking in terms of political culture in the Arab world. And I'm restricting it to the Arab world while naturally generalizing in terms of the various locales, because it is considerably different from one to the other. The two elements that are lacking today are trust, that creates a middle ground that diffuses the polarization that we see. This is element number one. And element number two, an active civil society that constitutes a series of checks and balances vis-à-vis the state. These, in my mind, if we try to look at the background that leads to them, we can assess to what extent it is possible to have this coming century, a century in which these two elements are going to be remedied, and therefore maybe we can witness something along the lines of a democratic system that is indigenous, that is suitable for the many countries in the region. I'll propose to you that what we're witnessing today is some sort of a dialogue or a dialectical relation between three trends, each one of them having its own dynamic. And I'm going to talk about each one of them very briefly because of the time. The three trends in question, trend number one, is the completion of the formation of a nation state. Trend number two, paradoxically, is the dilution of the nation state. And trend number three is the resumption of a plural state. I'm sorry for, we need to clarify these terms in order, these notions, in order for them to make sense. Let me start by saying, and this is why I talked about the 19th century, not just the 20th century, as defining in this respect. The 19th century witnessed the importation, the appropriation, the assimilation of the European model at the level of the elites. The elites in the region, from Morocco to Tunisia to Egypt to Damascus and Baghdad to Istanbul, saw the European model. Now, again, it's not a question that this was the first exposure, but in the 19th century, the interest was, we like it, we would like to incorporate it. So we had quite a few experimentation, major ones in Istanbul, in Cairo, in Tunis, minor ones, let's say, for example, Medhat Basha in Damascus and Baghdad even. However, in all, what we're talking here about is the appropriation of ideas. I would term that the 19th century was the century of the appropriation of universal ideas that were still then European to a large extent. Now, the notion here is to transition from the concept of a leader state to the concept of a nation state. And this is why I am speaking about the completion of the nation state model. Here I have to talk about this leader state concept a little bit. Throughout Islamic history, with no exception, from the moment the first Islamic state was created in Medina in the 7th century up until well into the 19th century and beyond, the one model that operated throughout was the leader state, and for that matter, the dynastic leader state. Notice, for example, even in the case of the Mamluks, where dynasties were not needed because the Mamluks are not a dynasty, they recruit in a different form. Nonetheless, the fiction of a dynastic legitimacy was still kept. The reason this is important, and I'm going to link this very notion of the leader state to the fact that there is no trust, meaning the notion of trust is not developed, and the notion of a social contract or a social compact is not developed in these regions. So what we have, therefore, if the 19th century was the century of ideas, the 20th century was the century of the state, of the implementation of these ideas. However, without the checks and balances that in the European model had developed through the interplay, through the dialectical relations between state and society. So what we have, therefore, is the emergence of states that are presumably nation states. This is what Nadim referred to as the Kemalist model. But as a matter of fact, they reproduced, to a large extent, the leader state model from before, because simply now with new methods, with an expanded function for the state. Because if the function of the state prior to that was somehow limited and mostly in terms of the relationship with the individual, mostly consisting of conscription and taxation, Now the state was presumably moving more and more towards a totalitarian desire, if not a totalitarian reality, by becoming responsible for religion, becoming responsible for personal affairs, etc. And with the expansion of the state along those forms, we got the repetition of dysfunctional models that effectively, all of them, without any exception, failed. The more conservative in their approach, those who kept the dynastic model instead of trying to reproduce it, seem to be more resilient to change. This is why we see that the monarchies are in a far better place than the so-called republics. And at the same time, we saw in each one of those so-called republics a desire to reproduce not just the leader model, but the dynastic leader model. So in a sense, if we follow this trajectory, we can think of the 21st century and the so-called Arab Spring, which actually I would like to confirm it in my depiction as an Arab Spring, because it does constitute a paradigm shift, an attempt to correct the model along the lines of trying to create societal structures that balance the state, even if in its original state we're still talking about chaos. But what has changed in the process of the paradigm shift in question is indeed, and this is where we can talk about completion of the nation-state model, the Arab Spring is about the empowerment of the citizen. When we talk about the collapse of the wall of fear, in particular, we talk about the whole notion that now the citizen, in whichever form, is responsible for checking on the state. So we're moving away from the patriarchal model, from the paternalistic state, towards a model still undefined, still confused, but nonetheless in which the state is subject to society and not just the reverse. Again, so this is the process of the completion of the nation-state. However, fortunately or unfortunately, because of the global patterns, the process of completion of the nation-state in the Arab region goes hand in hand with the process of dilution of the nation-state. We've talked about yesterday about how the Westphalian model of a nation-state is really no longer tenable in a world in which we have international law, we have international conventions, we have an international consciousness, and an international civil society movement that effectively does not allow the type of independence on the part of rulers in particular to act, but also, meaning we are a far more integrated world. And in that sense, we have here the paradox that to a large extent is creating a lot of tension in these Arab domains, because on the one hand, we're trying to develop institutions and the systems through which society will balance the state, but on the other hand, these systems and institutions also would like to remain at a level, whether it's regional or global, they in a certain sense weaken the state. However, the picture is not complete in order to assess what comes next if we do not talk and very intensely about what is very specific to the region, the resumption of the plural state. Here, I would propose to you that throughout the history of the region, states have been either singular or plural. A typical example of the singular state would be the Byzantine Empire, trying to impose on Armenians, on Copts, and on Syrians the whole notion of the supremacy of its own creed. And then these various populations resisting by insisting on a different theological outlook, but actually in order to ensure, in a certain sense, their plural identity. The counterexample to the Byzantine model is the Sasanian model, which accepted the Eastern Church, the so-called Nestorian Church, which accepted Judaism, which accepted others, and allowed them to have their own millah. It was not called millah then, but I'm using millah in particular because the last example of the successful plural state in the region was exactly the Ottoman Sultanate. The Ottoman Sultanate actually was lived for more than 400 years in the region, elsewhere actually even more, on the basis of not having the tensions that result from trying to impose a singular state. Now, the Ottoman model realized early on that it was no longer tenable to have the internal organization of the plural model, that of a paramount community or a primary community and then secondary communities. This is why we witness, starting with the 19th century, a trajectory with the Tanzimat, what we have is the trajectory towards moving towards equalizing the various communities. The Sunni or the Muslim community was still on top, was still paramount, but somehow through the Tanzimat we're talking about a rehabilitation or a habilitation of the various communities. I would propose to you that this model, the model of the plural state, was interrupted by the sudden application in the Ottoman domain of the singular state. I mean, the most glaring example would be exactly the Turkish Republic, with its homogenizing direction, but also, and very much so, Arab nationalism, Zionism. These were all homogenizing. However, and here is what's interesting, the plural model actually lives in two places in different ways. In Lebanon, it lives as an evolution of what was, because the state is at an equal distance from everyone, but with the two oddities. One is that it is frozen, it's not allowed to progress, and the second oddity is that effectively you have lost the possibility of, I mean, everyone looks at this model as being an atavistic kind of relic of the past that needs to be bypassed.